Geno Smith is number one, and this is just this past year in 2024. He had 4,320 yards. Beat his own record that he had set in 2022 with 4,282 yards. Now, welcome to Just the Stats NFL, the show that covers the NFL statistical leaders from the all-time greats to the current players leading the NFL. I'm Ernie Jennings, your host, and today we're looking at another team from the NFC West. So I'm on my way to finishing a look at every team in the NFL. Thankfully, preseason is over. That third preseason game for a lot of teams didn't mean much as far as starters go, but some teams still did actually play their starters in that final preseason game. The preseason's over, 10 days until the first game of the regular season for the NFL. Looking forward to that. So like I said, we're going to look at the Seattle Seahawks today, and we're going to take a look at the greatest Seahawks, the team from 2024, and then an outlook for 2025 season. So last season, the Seahawks finished second in the division despite having the same record as the Los Angeles Rams, and it made a huge difference, the fact that they finished second. But based on a tiebreaker called strength of victory, the Rams were able to take the first place spot, putting Seahawks second. But with a 10-7 record that they both had, Rams make the playoffs as a wild card. Seahawks do not make the playoffs. So that tiebreaker was a huge difference for the team. Now, the Seahawks were 10-7, as I said. At home, they were 3-6. On the road, 7-1, and in the division, 4-2. An amazing record on the road, 7-1. Now, if they could just do a little better at home, they would definitely have a good shot. Now, the Rams and Seahawks were the only two teams in the NFC West to have a winning record. All right, let's take a look at the team, see who's the greatest of all time for the Seahawks, and compare those to the rest of the NFL on this episode of Just the Stats NFL. All right, we'll start with the coaches. This is interesting because this team's been around since 1976. I was just talking about the Rams, who've been around since 1937. Their top coach has 80 wins. Here at Seattle, with a team only since 1976, have three coaches that have at least 80 wins. But Pete Carroll is at the top of the list with 137, only one over 100. He was coach from 2010 to 2023, took last year off, and now you can find him in the same division, but this time coaching for the Raiders. So that'll be interesting to see how those matchups goes. But he had 137 wins, all-time leader in wins for the team. All right, let's start off now with the passing records. Quarterbacks, all-time career-wise, let's flip these around here. All-time for the team is Russell Wilson, 37,059 yards. He was from 2012 to 2021. He's bounced around with Denver and now Jets, but he's been around a few teams since he's left. But the vast majority and the quality years also of his career were with the Seahawks. Now, Geno Smith was fifth with only 12,961 yards, but now after his initial time there from 2020 to last year, he has now moved on to the Raiders along with the coach, the previous coach for the team. So that's kind of interesting. But Geno Smith was fifth. So we'll see how that goes, comparing him to Sam Darnold, who's coming in to replace him. We'll look at some of the similarities between the two of them when we get down to like the season records, but be interesting to see how much of an improvement, if there is an improvement, with Sam Darnold coming in to replace Geno Smith, and why you would even want to do a move like that. So when it comes to touchdowns for the team, Russell Wilson, again, 292 touchdowns, quite a big gap over between him and David Krieg from 1980 to 1991 had 195. Geno Smith was fifth with 76 with a team before he's left. So those are your top quarterbacks as far as yards and touchdowns. When we're looking interceptions, well, Dave Krieg did have that with 148 interceptions in his career. Russell Wilson had 87 with his career with a team, and Geno Smith had 36 before he left. No one's approaching David Krieg at any time soon. Now, when it comes to sacks, though, this is some big numbers here a little bit. Russell Wilson, 427 times he was sacked. That's quite a bit, really, to be honest, and not something you like to see. Russell Wilson, in fact, is already going into this season. He's already the fourth all-time leader in sacks with 560. Now, fortunately for him, and we'll see, he's in a race really with Aaron Rodgers, who's first all-time with 571. So depending on who gets sacked more, it's a possibility Russell Wilson could actually pass Aaron Rodgers. Now, if you're a fan of Russell Wilson, you hope not, but if you're a fan of Rodgers, you're looking into that. And in fact, in the top 8 sacked all-time players, you got 3 of them that are currently playing. Rodgers, Brady, and Matthew Stafford went over the 500 sack mark last season, but he's 8th all-time. But Russell Wilson's up there at 427. Now, Geno Smith already had 141 in his career. Not being sacked quite at the same rate as Russell Wilson was, but still a pretty hefty rate of being sacked at a 7.5% rate. That's a little high. So those are your quarterbacks, and no one pushing the top of the leaderboard where Russell Wilson is anytime soon, especially when you bring in Sam Darnold, and we'll see how long he stays with the team, if he's a long-term solution or what. All right, let's look at the running backs. Here you have Shaun Alexander by a long ways. Shaun Alexander from 2000 to 2007 had 9,429 yards. Chris Warren was second from 1990 to 1997 with only 6,706 yards. Those are your top 2. So really, Shaun Alexander has a huge lead over anybody else on the team. Now, Russell Wilson is 5th all-time rushing for the Seattle Seahawks with 4,689 yards. Pretty interesting that your quarterback is the 5th all-time leader on the team. Those are your top players. Now, currently, when you're talking about strictly running back, Kenneth Walker, who's been with the team since 2022, only has 2,528 yards. He's 11th all-time on the team. Now, he could, move up the list a few spots if he could just stay healthy. That's his problem. He cannot play. Out of 17 games last season, I think he played 11. He just doesn't stay healthy, so we'll see where he ends up. And Zach Charbonnet is 23rd on the team, a year behind Kenneth Walker coming into the NFL. He just has a little over 1,000 yards. So, again, no one, and I don't see Kenneth Walker reaching Shaun Alexander with the way his health is. He's already having issues and the season hasn't even started. Now, touchdowns, Shaun Alexander has 100. This is by far the biggest margin. Marshawn Lynch from 2010 to 2019 has 58. Shaun Alexander almost double the next player. And again, you have Russell Wilson, who's 8th all-time on the touchdown rushing list with 23 as a quarterback. Pretty incredible. Kenneth Walker is tied for 6th with 24, only one more than Russell Wilson. So now he'll move up this list no farther than passing Sherman Smith with 28. So he won't reach Chris Warren, who's got 44. He won't make that far up this next season. But and depending on how healthy he is, he could move into 4th the following year. But right now, those are your top 2. Zach Charbonnet only has 9 rushing TDs in his 2 seasons so far. Those are your running backs. Now, looking at the wide receivers and the tight ends, and actually also the running backs out of the backfield. Look at some of those. Now, when we're looking at receptions all time for the team in receptions, well, that's Steve Largent, had 819 receptions. Tyler Lockett, who was with the team from 2015 to 2024, is second with 661. So even if he'd have stayed with the team, he would not have, for another year, he would not have caught Steve Largent. Steve Largent's number one on the list all time for the team. Now, like I said, Tyler Lockett was second. DK Metcalf was seventh with 438. He's gone as well to the Pittsburgh Steelers. So both of those players are gone. A new one they've brought in is Cooper Kupp. So we'll see how he does with the team. But when you're talking about current players, you have Jackson Smith-Njigba with 163 receptions. He's now the man for the team, and we will see how he does coming into as the team's number one wide receiver. It's going to be interesting to see how this season plays out for the team. All right. So those are the wide receivers. Now looking at the tight ends, all time, Jimmy Graham is the leader all time, despite the fact that he's only with the team a few years. But he has 170 receptions to lead the team career-wise in receptions. Noah Fant was 33rd with 130, and he might have caught him this year if he'd have been with the team, but they cut him. So he's now with the Bengals, so he's out. And they just have this rookie that they had last year come in who will now be the starter, A.J. Barner. So we'll see how he does. But again, nobody's challenging the tight end record either. And we're looking at running backs as far as receptions go. It's John Williams from 1986 to 1993 had 471 receptions to be fifth all-time on the team list as he was a fullback. This is a huge lead over anybody else. Kenneth Walker right now is 40th on the team all-time in receptions, and that's only with 102. So again, he's not going to catch John Williams most likely ever, not the way he plays currently as far as his health goes. So we're looking at yards. Again, this is Steve Largent, 13,089 yards. Quite an impressive player he was in his time. One of the, not very fast, but you just could never keep tabs on him. He was always quite pretty impressive, as a wide receiver. But he's got a huge lead over Tyler Lockett, who was second with 8,594. So again, Tyler Lockett was never going to catch Steve Largent for number one on the list. And again, like I said, he's gone. DK Metcalf is gone. He was sixth on the list. They're both gone. So now you're down to Jackson Smith-Njigba, who is 22nd on the list all time right now with only 1,758 yards. Now, he had a 1,000-yard season. He has another one. Obviously, he'll move way up the list, almost probably to number 12. That's probably as far as he's going to make it. So he'd be impressive to see if he can do that. Now, in looking at tight ends, now this is interesting. Even though Jimmy Smith did not spend most of his career with the team, he still was one of the best tight ends. And we'll look at that when we, as far as receptions go. Let me see where Jimmy Smith was in receptions. I guess we'll look at that as far as single season. But Jimmy Graham was 19th on the team with receptions. And then in yards, let's see, Jimmy Smith was the leading tight end. I had him here for a second. With 2,048 yards to finish 17th on the team as far as receptions go. It's receiving yards, I should say. So really nobody that high. Now looking at the TD category, Steve Largent hit the 100 touchdowns receiving, one of only 11 wide receivers or receivers period, not just wide receivers because you're talking tight ends as well. Only one of 12 to have 100 receiving touchdowns. Really impressive. Tyler Lockett, second on the team, was 61. So a huge difference. Now, DK Metcalf had 48 already. So he would have had a chance. But like I said, Lockett's second, Metcalf's fourth. They're both gone. So now you're dropped down to Jackson Smith-Njigba, who's only got 10 in his 2 years there. So he'll be the guy to watch from now on to see how he does. If he can pick up the slack and really basically try to double-digit touchdowns this next season. All right, let's look at the defense. All right. So looking at the defense all time in interceptions, currently the all-time leader in interceptions for the team, and I'm bringing it up, is Dave Brown from 1976 to 1986. He had 50 interceptions in his career. He's big lead over Eugene Robinson from 85 to 95, who had 42. Currently, Rick Woolen is 25th all-time on the team with 11. So long way for him to go, but he's been on the team for only since 2022. So you give him some time, we'll see how he does. But that's your top player on the team currently as far as interceptions go. Julian Love has 7 for the team. So those are your leading interception men. Looking at tackles for loss. Now here, nobody over 100, which is rare, not actually even anybody over 80 tackles for loss in a career for the team. Bobby Wagner had 79. From 2012 to 2023 at 79. Michael Bennett was second from 2013 to 2017, but he only had 69. So those are your top 2 players. And so again, nobody's that far up this list. Now currently, Jaron Reed, who's been with the team though since 2016, he's 10th on the list with 34. So with that many years, he's not going to make it too far up the list. So when you're looking at a more current player, you have Leonard Williams, who's only been on the team 2 years. He's already their top guy. I mean, he's going to be. He's got 25 tackles for loss already in 2 years. So he's averaging over double digits in tackles for loss. So he will be somebody to definitely watch as his career moves on. Now looking at sacks, Jacob Green has 115.5 sacks to lead the team by a long ways. He played for the team from 1980 to 1991, had 115.5 sacks. Really incredible. Michael Sinclair was second with 73.5, so a big drop. Now again, when we're looking at sacks, it's Jaron Reed again. Currently, he's 12th all-time with only 33.5 sacks. Boye Mafe is the next guy up at 28th, quite a ways down the list, but he's been with the team since 2022. Now he has 18 sacks, but the guy we're going to be watching again is Leonard Williams, who's already has 15 in his 2 years there. So if he can improve a little bit, he's a guy that could move up the list. I don't know if he, depending on how his career continues, we'll see if he can make it as high as Jacob Green, though. All right, let's look at the single season numbers, records for a single season. We'll start with the quarterbacks. Now, again, this is a little comparison between Geno Smith and Sam Darnold, who's now the quarterback. But last year, Geno Smith had the number 1. All right, let's look at the single season offensive records. And we'll start with the quarterbacks. Geno Smith is number 1. And this is just this past year in 2024. He had 4,320 yards. Beat his own record that he had set in 2022 with 4,282 yards. Now, I'm looking at Sam Darnold, who was playing for Minnesota last year, and comparing Geno Smith and Sam Darnold as we go through these passing numbers for single season. Well, Sam Darnold had 4,319 yards for Minnesota last year. 1 yard difference than Geno Smith. That's incredible. So those are the yardage numbers. Now looking at touchdowns, well, Russell Wilson for the team has the top 4 spots. His best was in 2020 when he had 40 touchdowns throwing. Geno Smith last season had 21. So despite throwing for the most yardage, he really didn't have anywhere near the type of touchdown throws that Russell Wilson had, basically almost half, despite throwing for over 100 yards more. Now, last season, Sam Darnold for Minnesota had 35 touchdowns throwing. Big difference between him and Geno Smith in that category. Now, when we're looking at interceptions for the team, for the Seattle Seahawks, Jim Zorn in 1976 had 27 interceptions, which was the most by the team ever, which, by the way, was the first year it was in existence. So that very first year, he set the records. No one's ever broken it, and very likely will not break it. Nobody. Well, 2010, Matt Hasselbeck had 17. So honestly, no one's even close to this record. Geno Smith had 15, which put him in the NFL, put him like in 5th as far as interceptions go. So not one of your better numbers. But 15 is nowhere near that 27 that Jim Zorn had. Now, Sam Darnold last year had 12. So big difference. Not too big, I should say. Considering they only had 1 yard difference, Geno Smith threw 3 more interceptions than Sam Darnold did, and threw quite a few less touchdown passes as well, 21 to 35. So while Sam Darnold's got almost a 3-to-1 ratio, Geno Smith doesn't even have a 2-to-1 ratio as far as touchdowns to interceptions. So that is kind of interesting right there. Now, when it comes to being sacked, Geno Smith almost set the record for the Seattle Seahawks last season when he had 50. Dave Krieg has that record. He had 52. Russell Wilson had 51. So Dave Krieg in 1985 had 52. Russell Wilson in 2018 had 51. And Geno Smith just this last year had 50. So 3 guys that have hit the 50 mark. Now, Sam Darnold from Minnesota had 48. So pretty close there when it comes to the sack department. So those are your 2 quarterbacks, one going out, one coming in, kind of a comparison. And if you're just looking at those raw numbers, I guess I give Sam Darnold a little edge. Much better with the ball as far as touchdown passes compared to interceptions. Otherwise, same in sacks and yardage, basically. So pretty close, though. All right. Let's look at the running backs. Now here, again, there's nobody on the team currently that has any chance of breaking any records, I don't think. Shaun Alexander in 2005 broke a record he had set in 2004. 2004, he had 1,696 yards, which was the best the team had. And then in 2005, he came right back with 1,880 yards. Pretty impressive. Those are your top 2 numbers. When you're looking at the current running backs, as far as yards go, they're not even in the top 50. In fact, it's pretty interesting. Kenneth Walker was 53rd. He had 573 yards. Zach Charbonnet had 569, right behind him. 4-yard difference they had as far as rushing goes last year. Now, the big difference is Kenneth Walker only played in 11 games. Zach Charbonnet, though he was in every game, he started in only 6 games. And yet they only had a 4-yard difference as far as yardage goes. So unless Walker can stay on the field, I don't see him moving too far up the list. And in fact, when you think about it, he played 11 games. He had 573 yards. So I'm not sure he would have made it to even 1,000 yards, even if he had played every game. Maybe he would have. He might have come out of some of those games early when he got hurt. Now, here's a number that I know no one's going to break for quite a long time, and that is touchdowns in a single season. Shaun Alexander had set the mark at 16 in 2002 and 2004, but then in 2005, he had 27 touchdowns rushing. That was the record only for 1 year. He had tied the record Priest Holmes had set in 2003. Well, then LaDainian Tomlinson in 2006 came along and had 28 touchdowns rushing to set the record that Shaun Alexander had set only the year before. But still, so Shaun Alexander's second all-time in rushing TDs in a single season. That will be a very difficult record to break. It's only 11 times, I should say, that somebody's had at least 20 touchdowns. So that's going to be a tough record right there. Now, when it comes to the players on the team, again, this past season, Zach Charbonnet had 8 and Walker had 7. So even between them, they had 15. That's the best they had. All right, let's look at the wide receivers, tight ends, and even running backs coming out of the backfield. All right. Only 2 times in the Seattle Seahawks history since 1976 has a player had 100 receptions in a single season. That was Tyler Lockett in 2020, had 100 exactly, and Jackson Smith-Njigba last year had 100 exactly. That's the record. 100. I predict, and I had a podcast where I went through every single team predicting one record that they would break, whatever category, whatever it was. And I picked Jackson Smith-Njigba to go over 100 receptions this next season. He won't have Tyler Lockett or DK Metcalf there. He'll have Cooper Kupp, but I think he has a good shot at it. This past season, it was Smith-Njigba with 100, and then way down, you had DK Metcalf with 66. Those are your top 2 wide receivers when it came to receptions. So you give some of those receptions that Tyler Lockett and Metcalf had to Njigba, and you might get him over the 100 receptions. So that's your top ones there. Now, this past season, like I said, Metcalf was way down at 40th with only 66, and Jackson Smith-Njigba tied for first all time. When we're looking at tight ends in a single season, this is a team that did not favor tight ends the way some other teams have. Jimmy Graham in 2016 had 65 receptions. That's the most ever by a tight end for the Seattle Seahawks. That's quite a ways down there compared to some other teams. There's been 12 players, 12 tight ends. Well, I shouldn't say 12 times somebody's had 100. And Jimmy Graham has had more when he was with the Saints than 65. But for Seattle, it's just not a focus the same way. And Noah Fant last year, and now he was cut and he's sent over to the Bengals, but he had 48 to lead tight ends from 2024. The rookie they had last year, A.J. Barner, had 30, and now he'll be the top guy. We'll see how he does and if they change their focus at all as far as throwing to tight ends. But if we're going with history, they won't. You won't see anybody getting too many. Now, without Font there, and Barner had 30 and Font had 48, it's a possibility Barner could actually pass Graham for most. So that's a number we'll watch. When we're looking at running backs, again, it's the same type of situation. John Williams is 19th all-time. In 1989, he had 76 receptions. That's the most by a player from the backfield. Now, this past season, Kenneth Walker and Zach Charbonnet were so far down the all-time list, it's not even worth talking about. But they did have 46 for Walker, and Charbonnet had 42. So again, very close as far as that category goes. All right, so that's receptions. Now, when looking at yards, this is a big difference because Tyler Lockett had 100, but as far as yards go, he wasn't the number one guy when it comes to yards. Either was Smith-Njigba. That would be DK Metcalf, who gets quite a bit of yardage per reception. But in 2020, Metcalf led the Seahawks all-time in single-season record with 1,303 yards. That's the record. Steve Largent had held the record since 1985 with 1,287. 35 years it took before Metcalf broke that record. I do think there's a good possibility that Smith-Njigba breaks the record this year. This past season, he led the team with 1,130 yards, which is good enough for 12th all-time on the Seahawks list. So there's a good shot that he has a shot. He has a chance. Now, Metcalf almost hit the 1,000 yard mark. He had 992 yards. So he was pretty close, considering that he only started 12 games, only played in 15 and started 12 of them. If he could have just been a little bit healthier, he would have easily passed the 1,000-yard mark. All right. Now that's your wide receivers. Again, when we're looking at tight ends, Jimmy Graham has the best yardage in a single season, and that was 923 on only 65 receptions. That's a 14.2 yards per reception. That's really good for a tight end. But that was in 2016. That was the best ever. Now, Font had 500 yards last year, and Barner had 245. So I don't expect to see either one of, well, Font's not there, but Barner getting anywhere near this record that Graham has. And in fact, Jimmy Graham, he didn't do this, and this is why he was probably picked up by Seattle, but when he was with the New Orleans Saints, he had the 7th best receiving yardage total ever by a tight end with 1,310 yards, which would have been good enough to be number 1 all time for the Seattle Seahawks by 7 yards. So pretty impressive. Only 7 times as a wide receiver had more than 1,300 yards, and Travis Kelce did it twice. 3 times, actually. 3 out of the top 7 times Travis Kelce. What's interesting is you got Travis Kelce, George Kittle, Mark Andrews all on this list, and they're all still playing. So I don't expect to see Mark Andrews ever get up there again, but that's pretty impressive. I am hoping that George Kittle will, because I do have him on one of my fantasy teams. Now, when we're looking at running backs, again, this is an area where, again, they do not focus on running backs the way they do wide receivers. The best was John Williams again, only 68th best for the team. In 1990, he had 699 yards. That's the best. This past season, Charbonnet had 340 and Walker had 299. So despite they both had in the 40s in receptions, they just didn't have that many yards. When you have 48 receptions and only 340, well, actually, Charbonnet only had 42. He had 42 receptions and 340 yards. So, less than 10 yards of reception. And Walker's was even worse as far as yards per reception goes. So, not very impressive. And in fact, we can look at that exactly and tell you, just out of curiosity, Charbonnet averaged 8.1 yards per reception. And Walker averaged 6.5 yards per reception. So really not too impressive. So those are your receivers when it comes to yards and receptions. Now, when it comes to touchdowns receiving, that Steve Largent holds the record for 100 in a career. Doug Baldwin had 14 touchdowns receiving in 2015. That is the record. He had broke a record that Darrell Turner had set in 1985, so 30 years earlier, with 13. Steve Largent's best ever, and he had 100. Remember, he had 100 receptions in his career, touchdown receptions, but his best was 12 in 1984, so he's very consistent year in, year out. Now, this past season, Jackson Smith and Jigba had 6, and DK Metcalf had 5. So those are your top 2 players. No one even close to 10. Now, when we're looking at tight ends, again, this past season, Barner had 4, and Noah Fant had 1. Maybe one of the reasons they felt comfortable with Barner taking over and moving Fant off the roster. Now, Jimmy Graham had 10. He holds the record by a tight end, 10 receptions receiving. And in fact, again, with the New Orleans Saints, in 2013, Jimmy Graham had 16 touchdowns receptions, which is second all time, only to Rob Gronkowski, who had 17. So another record that Jimmy Graham had before he got to Seattle. Not that he wasn't good with Seattle, but he was, superior when he was with the Saints. Now, when it comes to the running backs, John Williams, again, way down the list, tied for 41th all time on touchdowns with only 6 receiving. So running backs just don't feature in again, like I said. And Charbonnet had 1 as far as touchdowns receiving go for the team. That's it. So those are your guys. Now, let's look at the defense. So when looking at the defense, all time as far as interceptions go, is Kenny Easley in 1984 and John Harris in 1981 had 10 interceptions in a single season. That's the record. Now, this past season, 3 players for the Seahawks, which kind of gives you a good coverage. You feel like any which way somebody's going to throw the ball, there's a chance it's intercepted. But it was tied for 19th in the NFL last season, but 3 players had 3 interceptions: Kobe Bryant, Julian Love, and Rick Woolen. So that's, it's kind of interesting that you have 3 players. I don't know of another team that had 3 players with 3 or more interceptions. There may have been, and I just can't remember it offhand. Often you have 1 player with a high number, maybe 2, and then the rest are way down there. But those are your top players as far as interceptions go. Now, when it comes to tackles for loss, Michael Bennett had 18 in 2015. Now, Leonard Williams had 16, which ties him for second all time on the team. There's 3 players that had 16. Now, Leonard Williams has only been on the team for 2 years. So he's an exciting player to watch and see how he comes along. He's already proven that he's I think, the best player on the team currently. So we'll see how that goes, but he really has been impressive. All right. That was tackles for loss. And the last category is sacks. Michael Sinclair in 1998 had 16 and a half sacks, and Jacob Green in 1983 had 16. Those are your top 2 players. Now, Leonard Williams had 11, only player in double digits, and the same goes for tackles for loss. Leonard Williams is the only one in double digits there as well. So Leonard Williams is the guy to watch. He's only in his second year. You could see some improvement. Maybe he has a chance in a year or 2 to get up closer to that 16 mark as far as sacks goes. He's already close on the tackles for loss. So he's the guy to watch for this particular team. All right, that is the team. Now let's look at the team outlook. What do we think? BetMGM has them only at 7.5 wins. Now you remember they had 10 wins. Fox Sports has them at 8.5 wins. I'm going to split the difference, and I think they're only going to have 8 wins despite having 10 last season. And I'll tell you why. It's that I do not think that Cooper Kupp and Smith-Njigba are good enough to replace Metcalf, Lockett, and Smith-Njigba. I'm curious as to how good Smith-Njigba will be without Metcalf on the field. And it really all depends. If Cooper Kupp can get back to the way he was a couple years ago, then I think there is a chance that they have a better record than 8 wins. Their offensive line is questionable, which then puts you back to looking at their quarterback that they just picked up in Sam Darnold. Is he really better than Smith? He may be a little bit, but he's not as mobile. So if he had 48 sacks with Minnesota, I'm just afraid of how many sacks he's going to have this season. They like to throw the ball down the field, which means you have to hang on to it for that split second longer. So we'll see. Also, the other teams in the division have made some huge improvements, and we'll see if they can stand up to the other teams within the division. So I'm putting them at 8 wins. It's going to be a down year for them. And if I'm wrong, it's because Cooper Kupp did come through, Sam Darnold did come through, and somebody like Kenneth Walker stayed on the field for the entire season. We'll see. And speaking of him, when we're looking at the fantasy outlook, Jackson Smith-Njigba has been wide receiver 17, and he's been going out in the 3rd round, at the end of the 3rd round, like somewhere around that area, whereas Kenneth Walker's been going at the beginning of the 4th round. He's RB 14. And I think what's holding Kenneth Walker back and why he's dropping into the 4th round is that people are worried about his health. He's always injured, and he's already injured right now. And it's minor, whatever they want to say, but you can't even get to the season before he's already having these injuries of different sorts. So when you're saying your 2 best players are being drafted at the end of the 3rd or beginning of the 4th round, that to me makes me question their ability to get more than 8 wins. Now, Cooper Kupp's going at the very end of the 7th round. You could probably get him in the 8th. Now, he could be a steal if he is better than he looked last year at the end of last year, and he looks more like he did 2 years ago, and you can get him at the end of the 7th, the beginning of the 8th, you're getting a steal right there. You could. Now, if he looks like he did the end of last year, then you're not. But then you can just dump him. I mean, you're not really losing out too badly if you dump somebody that you picked up in the 8th round or so. Now, if you are somebody who is betting on Kenneth Walker having a good season, then I would suggest you pick up Zach Charbonnet toward the end of the 9th round. You might get him in the 10th, but he's been going in the late 9th round. That way, when I should say if and when, but I'm saying more like when Kenneth Walker misses a game, Zach Charbonnet does come in and puts up good numbers, basically equal to Kenneth Walker. So you're not going to lose out too much if you can pick up Charbonnet to back up Walker if you pick him up. Those are really the only players that are going in the draft. You can pick up Sam Darnold usually in waivers, off the waiver, if you're playing in a 1-quarterback league. So those are your players. Unfortunately, if you're a Seattle Seahawks fan like my dad, I just don't expect big things this year, but we'll wait and see. All right, next podcast, we'll be looking at the Arizona Cardinals now that we've wrapped up the Seattle Seahawks. 2 teams left in the NFC West, and we're done looking at every team in the NFL. So if you want to hear about teams from players from other teams, you can go and listen to my previous podcasts. You can find those on YouTube at Just the Stats NFL. Also, you can find them on Spotify, Apple, or any other source you use for your podcast. Appreciate you listening. Like I said, you can get in touch with me, leave comments on YouTube at Just the Stats NFL or email at justthestatsnfl@gmail.com. Appreciate you listening. And that is a wrap for this episode of Just the Stats NFL. Until next time, I am out.